doing full-on Michael Jackson moves, tried it again and again, over and over. And the moonwalk is very challenging.
There are stories Hollywood manufactures, and then there are stories Hollywood couldn't invent if it tried. The story of Jaafar Jackson belongs entirely to the second category. Before a single frame of the 2026 Michael biopic was shot, before a costume was fitted or a stage was lit, there was a young man alone in a house full of ghosts, pressing his back against a wall covered in handwritten affirmations, listening to silence that used to contain the greatest entertainer who ever lived. What happened inside that house over the course of 3 relentless years is the kind of transformation that defies easy description. It wasn't preparation. It wasn't rehearsal. It was something closer to a controlled psychological dissolution, a deliberate and methodical erasure of one person's identity so that another could briefly breathe again through his body. And the price Jaafar paid, measured in blood-soaked loafers, sleepless nights on a thin mattress pressed against a cold floor, and secrets kept from his own mother for an entire calendar year, would have broken almost anyone who attempted it. But here is what nobody tells you about this story, the part that gets lost underneath the headlines about bleeding feet and vocal genetics and legal battles over reshoot budgets. The most remarkable part isn't the sacrifice itself. It's what was discovered waiting on the other side of it, something the entire production had spent 2 exhausting years convincing itself might not exist anywhere on Earth. The search that preceded Jaafar's casting didn't begin with optimism. It began with the quiet, professional confidence of people who believed that talent, given enough time and resources, could always be found. Graham King and Antoine Fuqua approached the casting of Michael Jackson with the seriousness the subject demanded. They set parameters. They built a search infrastructure. They evaluated nearly 200 candidates across months of global outreach. And what they encountered at every turn was the same fundamental problem dressed in slightly different clothing. Professional impersonators arrived first, men and women who had spent entire careers perfecting a single moonwalk, who could reproduce the physical vocabulary of Michael Jackson with extraordinary technical precision. The cameras loved them for about 40 seconds. Then something collapsed. The authenticity evaporated the moment a scene required genuine emotional weight rather than choreographic accuracy. Classically trained actors followed, performers with real emotional range and serious craft, but who couldn't locate the specific physical language of a man whose every gesture had been studied and cataloged by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Viral dance sensations came next, younger performers whose bodies had absorbed contemporary movement, but whose understanding of Michael's interior emotional world was surface level at best. Every audition tape, every screen test, every Zoom call from a time zone 12 hours removed began to feel like a copy of a copy of a copy, each generation slightly more degraded than the last, technically competent in isolated moments, but spiritually hollow in the sustained way a feature film requires. Fuqua later described the accumulating despair of that period with a directness that was almost startling. They were looking for a needle in a haystack that might not even exist. The throne sat empty. The production's private fear, the one nobody said aloud in meetings, was that the only person who could truly play Michael Jackson was Michael Jackson himself, and that particular solution was permanently unavailable. What broke the deadlock wasn't a callback or a screen test or a recommendation from a talent agency. It was a voice note. Jaafar Jackson, who had never stepped onto a professional film set, whose entire acting resume consisted of a brief reality television appearance, bypassed the entire apparatus of formal auditioning and sent Graham King a simple audio recording from his phone. In it, he spoke quietly, inhabiting without apparent effort the breathy, guarded, emotionally fragile cadence that anyone who had spent time with Michael Jackson's interviews and off-camera moments would recognize instantly. King had actually encountered footage of Jaafar performing years earlier and had, with deliberate discipline, resisted the idea of casting family. The optics felt complicated. The perception of nepotism in a project already carrying enormous scrutiny seemed like a risk not worth taking. The voice note made every one of those calculations irrelevant. King played it once. He immediately called back. He said later that it stopped him completely in his tracks, that he felt something in that recording that was undeniably, unmistakably Michael, not imitation, not studied reproduction. but something genetic and unconscious and present in a way that no amount of coaching could have installed. That tiny digital file, transmitted casually between phones, accomplished in 30 seconds what 2 years of organized global searching had failed to produce. The production stopped hunting. The throne had its occupant. What nobody understood yet, including Jaafar himself, was the full cost of sitting in it. Jaafar Jackson had never wanted to be an actor. This is not a minor biographical detail. It is the load-bearing fact of the entire story, because it means that everything that followed was built not on ambition or career strategy, but on something rawer and stranger and ultimately more powerful. When King asked him directly whether he had any acting experience, his answer was immediate and completely unadorned. Never, and I've never wanted to be one. The learning curve he then faced was described by people close to the production as essentially vertical, a smooth wall with no handholds, slick with the accumulated pressure of global expectation. King assigned serious acting coaches who approached Jaafar's development not by adding technique onto an existing foundation, but by stripping him down to emotional nerve endings and rebuilding him from raw material upward, scene by scene, line by line, searching always for the vulnerability beneath the dialogue rather than the performance on top of it. Jaafar approached the inexperience not as a liability that needed to be hidden or compensated for, but as a strange kind of freedom. He had no habits to unlearn, no previously established screen persona to fight against. He treated his total lack of acting history as proof that he had nothing to lose and everything to prove, and he channeled that freedom directly into a ferocity of preparation that began alarming the people around him within the first few weeks. He dissected dialogue the way his uncle had dissected rhythm, hunting for the emotional intention buried beneath the surface meaning of every line, asking not what the words said but what the silence around them contained. The coaches had expected to spend months on fundamentals. What they found instead was someone who absorbed correction instantly and immediately pushed past it towards something they hadn't anticipated teaching. The physical cost arrived quickly and stayed indefinitely. Dance rehearsals under the supervision of choreographers who understood Michael's movement at a technical and historical level became a daily negotiation between ambition and physical limitation, and Jaafar consistently refused to honor the limitation. He has spoken about this with a candor that is almost uncomfortable in its specificity. He danced until his feet bled, routinely, not occasionally. Michael's iconic performance loafers, the smooth-soled shoes engineered specifically for gliding across a stage with the frictionless ease of someone partially suspended from gravity, were constructed with no rubber tread, no grip, no mercy for a pivot that landed even slightly wrong. Every misplaced weight shift punished him with fresh blisters layered on top of bruises that hadn't finished forming. Muscles seized during the nights in ways that made mornings feel like negotiating with a body that had filed a formal complaint. Toes became open wounds that the schedule refused to acknowledge. And beneath all of it ran a question that Jaafar said functioned simultaneously as a whip and a prayer across every single training day. What would Michael do? The answer was always the same. Michael would not stop. Michael would not accommodate the pain. Michael would push through the suffering and find something on the other side of it that ordinary effort couldn't reach. That inherited perfectionism transformed physical suffering into a form of currency, and Jaafar spent it without hesitation, every drop of blood a wordless offering to his uncle's memory. But the physical dimension was only one layer of what was being demanded. The deeper transformation was happening somewhere significantly harder to observe. Havenhurst, the sprawling Jackson family compound where Thriller was dreamed into existence, and where the entire trajectory of popular music shifted permanently in the early 1980s, became Jaafar's primary environment for the duration of preparation. He didn't use it as a training facility and commute home afterward. He moved back in. He slept there, rotating through different bedrooms night after night, describing his motivation as a need to feel the energy of the rooms, to locate whatever residue of his uncle's presence still lived in the walls and the floors, and the particular quality of the silence at 2 a.m. He rejected a proper bed entirely and placed a thin Japanese mattress directly on the floor, an aesthetic choice that seemed to reflect an unconscious understanding that comfort was incompatible with what he was attempting. The dance studio became his sanctuary and his torture chamber simultaneously. But the most psychologically significant development happened in a spare room he converted, over weeks of accumulation, into something Antoine Fuqua would later compare directly to the obsessive evidence board from the film A Beautiful Mind. Choreography diagrams covered one wall entirely. Handwritten timelines occupied another. Affirmations appeared and multiplied until they outnumbered the available surfaces. Then the Jackson estate made a decision that Jaafar described as a genuine psychological breaking point. They granted him access to Michael's private journals. Not the public record, not the documented interviews, not the archived performance footage. The handwritten private journals, containing poems that exposed wounds Michael had never shared publicly, daily mantras scrawled in margins, and censored fears captured in the raw, unfiltered language of someone writing only for themselves. Jaafar responded by filling every remaining inch of wall space with his own affirmations until no paint was visible anywhere in the room. The boundary between his psychology and his uncle's began dissolving deliberately and systematically, by design rather than by accident, and he stayed inside that dissolution long enough that distinguishing his own thoughts from the thoughts he was absorbing became genuinely complicated. The family dimensions of this story arrive with their own weight and their own complications, none of which resolved cleanly. For 12 full months, Jaafar told his mother absolutely nothing about what he was doing. The silence was total and deliberate. He understood, with a clarity that demonstrated significant emotional intelligence for someone in his mid-20s undertaking something of this magnitude, that the moment his mother learned the truth, the full crushing accumulated weight of the Jackson legacy would transfer immediately onto her. And the specific texture of a mother's worry about her child walking into that kind of scrutiny might destabilize him at precisely the moment when stability was the only thing keeping the preparation from collapsing entirely. He needed to find Michael in his own reflection before the people who loved him most had the opportunity to react to what they saw. When she finally came to the set, watching her son's posture reshape itself into Michael's characteristic shy inward tilt, hearing that whisper-soft voice emerge from the body she had known since his birth, the experience shook her in ways she had not prepared for and could not immediately process. His father Germain, who shared not just a bloodline with Michael but a childhood bedroom, a stage, and decades of unspoken brotherhood, had still not seen the finished film as of the most recent interviews. That absence functioned as the loudest review imaginable, the one that exists only in anticipation and cannot be managed or softened or prepared for through any available means. And then there was Catherine Jackson, the matriarch who raised Michael in a small house in Gary, Indiana, who knew every private dimension of who he actually was beneath the performance and the mythology and the spectacle, visited the set without significant fanfare. She watched Jaafar not during a formal performance, but in the quiet, unrehearsed moments between takes, the off-camera seconds when a performer either is or isn't the person they're trying to become. She didn't speak immediately. The room waited. Then, barely audible, she said 4 words to the person standing nearest to her. It's like seeing a ghost. Those 4 words, spoken without audience or calculation, in genuine involuntary reaction to what she was witnessing, silenced every doubt that had been circulating through the production since the first day of principal photography. No critical review, no audience tracking number, no box office projection could have delivered what those 4 words delivered to a young man who had spent 3 years and considerable quantities of his own blood working toward exactly this recognition. There is a moment that everyone present on the Michael set describes identically, regardless of their position in the production hierarchy or their proximity to the performance itself. It happened during a sustained, unbroken take of Man in the Mirror. Jaafar finished the song completely drenched in sweat, trembling visibly, still holding the final note's emotional weight somewhere in his chest rather than releasing it immediately into the air. He opened his eyes. The soundstage was completely frozen. Camera operators were openly crying, not dabbing at corners of their eyes, but crying with the unself-conscious lack of concern for appearances that happens when something catches people entirely off guard. The extras had stopped performing and were simply standing, motionless, arrested by something they hadn't expected and couldn't immediately categorize. Antoine Fuqua, a director of significant experience who had built his career on exacting standards and emotional precision, forgot to call cut. The silence that followed wasn't absence. It was the specific quality of silence that a room full of people produces when they have collectively witnessed something they will spend the rest of their careers describing to other people. In that suspended breath, nobody in the room was seeing a nephew anymore, or a performer, or a look-alike, or a genetic lottery winner who happened to share his uncle's vocal architecture. They were seeing only what they had been chasing through 2 years of exhausting global search and 3 years of brutal preparation. Something that felt, impossibly, like Michael. Not a reproduction, not a tribute. The real interior thing, briefly and startlingly present in a body that had paid an extraordinary price to contain it. When the final scene eventually wrapped, Jaafar didn't celebrate with the crew or attend the wrap party or do any of the things that mark the end of a long production for most of the people who survive one. He walked alone to his trailer, sat down, and removed the loafers that had cost him more skin than he had originally understood he possessed. He sat completely still in the quiet. What he said about that moment has stayed with everyone who heard it. I had to learn how to be Jaafar again. The role had occupied every available corner of his identity for years, methodically and by design, and its departure left behind the particular disorientation of someone who has deliberately dissolved themselves and must now remember what they were made of before the dissolution began. He is building that person now, writing music that carries his own voice rather than a blend of his and his uncle's, constructing an identity in public that belongs entirely to him rather than to the legacy he was entrusted to carry. He will always carry Michael, he says, with the calm certainty of someone who has earned the right to that statement through something more substantial than sentiment. But he cannot live inside him permanently. The biopic is his offering, his most complete and costly act of love directed toward a man he knew as a child and spent 3 years trying to resurrect as an adult. The man emerging from behind the glove is ready, finally and unmistakably, to introduce himself to a world that thought it understood this story before it had heard even half of it.